Welcome back to the Quantum Yoga Podcast. And today's special guest is Stephen Harrod Buhner, who, if I may say, a master herbalist and plant teacher and author of over 20 books. And I'm not sure where you are now in the authorship of books. I know you have a few more coming online soon that we can talk about briefly, but thank you for taking your time to talk to us.
Thanks for having me on.
A great way to start to kind of maybe understand a little bit of your perspective on the world and the sort of integral model of the world would be to perhaps start with Gaia theory. And as you mentioned to me, that led up to this call that you were personally investigating deep Gaia, and I'd love to start there.
Okay, it's oddly enough, just yesterday I finally decided to run off James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis's original papers on Gaia back from the 72, 73. I had never read the original stuff. So, I mean, it's an interesting thing that basically they were talking about something that human beings intuitively have always known to be true, and that is that the world is alive, that we're just part of this bigger thing. And, you know, people in the West would refer to it these days like Mother Nature or whatever. But James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis were looking at how the atmosphere of the Earth, it's basically made up of highly reactive gases, and it should not be that way, but it's held fairly stably so in this highly reactive state. And most planets' atmospheres tend to run down to just carbon dioxide and nitrogen over time because those are very stable states. And so Jim Lovelock had this sort of insight that the Earth, that something was keeping the atmosphere artificially that way. And Lynn Margulis's focus was on the microbial membrane that surrounds the Earth, and that had been her focus for a long time. And they sort of came together and realized in this kind of moment of epiphany that the Earth was a living superorganism, and that it acted just like any organism might, and it had kept its environment in the kind of the range that would support the emergence of life. Now, this was incredibly controversial at the time, and to make matters worse, Jim Lovelock's neighbor was William Golding, I believe, I'm pretty sure, and they were talking about it one day, and Jim Lovelock said, well, I don't know what to call this, and he said, well, you have to call it Gaia, of course, after the ancient goddess of the Earth. And of course that really upset all of the reductive scientists in the world and caused a lot of trouble. But you know, they attacked him, and then he thought it out more carefully in his research, and basically most scientists in the world, and using the sort of Western perspective, came to accept that the Earth acts like a living organism. Now, Earth system science says it acts like a living organism, but it's not. Shallow Gaia says it is a living organism, but it's not intelligent. And deep Gaia says it's a living organism just like any other, and it's highly intelligent, far more so than the human species. And that's sort of where I'm at in my experience. And I pretty much think that when we approach a living organism that's 4 billion years or so old, our species is maybe 35,000 years old. If you really want to stretch it out, maybe 1 million or so. But we don't really know very much, and our science is only, you know, a few hundred years old. So the best way, I think, to approach this is with a huge amount of humility, you know. And so that's Gaia. But really what that is, even though this has got an intellectual basis to it, now really what it is, it's something that every 4-year-old intuitively knows to be true, that sits under a tree talking with flowers, that meets the living beings of the earth as kindred beings, and that it's that we're just part of the circle of life, and everything's alive, it's different, but it's intelligent, it's capable of communication. And starting from that place, I think we get to a lot better outcome than assuming we're the only intelligent species on the planet and everything else, the earth is just a bundle of resources going around the sun that we can use however we want. So.
Yeah, as you're describing that, it the difference between shallow and deep Gaia, it strikes me as maybe the difference is one between intellectualizing the world, this Gaia world, and experiencing it almost in a more um, almost a more kinetic and kinesthetic way, where you're feeling it and you're sensing it, and it's not just a mentalization of it being out there.
Well, you're really right about that. And I mean, that's one of I think we're at a time when one paradigm is passing away and another paradigm is coming into being. And of course, whenever that happens in human history, we're in a time of great turmoil and conflict, because our entire Western civilization is based on this sort of old paradigm of, mechanical reductive view of the earth, and all of those institutions and businesses and everything are really, it's not sustainable anymore. But one of the things that really marks that older paradigm is this belief somehow that feelings were suspect, that our ability, that the response of our hearts to the touch of the world upon us was somehow a suspect thing, which is a really odd thing, because, most of the scientists that believe that were married. They loved their children and their families, so they had that root, but somehow extending it outward into the world itself frightened them or something. I don't know. There's a lot of different ways to talk about it. But basically, without that kinesthetic feeling, caring connection to the world, we become careless in our behavior. And of course, it seems obvious in hindsight that if we dismantle the ecological structures of the world, after a while, there's not going to be anything to keep us alive. But even more than that, it just feels bad. Every day when we go out into the world, all of us feel the impact of that way of thinking in the devastation of landscapes around us. And so a lot of people tend to begin to shut down because of that. And that is also a kind of an ecological wound that comes from that way of thinking. So in a sense, one of the greatest acts of disobedience now is to reclaim the response of our hearts to what's presented to the senses.
Mm. Mm. I've heard you mention the phrase heart cognition, especially in relationship to plant intelligence and to having a deeper relationship with plants. And, my background in sort of biofield theory and understanding the body from that perspective would suggest that you need to engage a lot more of your nervous system, the nervous system in the body, in the heart, in the gut, perhaps even, to participate in this relationship. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that happens if in many indigenous or ancient cultures, they were extremely clear, they would talk about, somebody would say, well, where do you live in your body? And they would gesture to the region of the chest. But if we're asked that, we point, about an inch above the eyebrows and a couple of inches into the skull. And, the seat of consciousness has changed. And that affects the way that we perceive the world. The brain isn't exactly a feeling organ. It's an organic computer, in a sense, that processes stuff and information. It stores memories, and it's great for thinking. But, it's like thinking without feeling is a kind of a dangerous thing. The mind is a great servant, but kind of a terrible master. And so, but it really turns out that we have a real ability to think with the heart. And in older cultures and indigenous cultures, for instance, that kind of thinking process would be very highly developed, and it becomes very sophisticated over time, very much like our thinking. When we start being trained to think, when we go to school, it's a very rudimentary and stumbling process, and it grows with sophistication over the years. But we're trained out of paying attention to our heart's response to the world, to our ability to think through the heart. And, there's people like Barbara McClintock, who won the Nobel Prize, or Luther Burbank, or Goethe, the great German poet, a great many people, and some of them really well-known scientists, Einstein among them, that talked about the necessity for being able to think through the heart, and that there's this kind of amazing state that occurs when the sophistication of heart cognition and sophistication of mind reach sort of the same level, and they join or fuse together into this sort of unique perceptual capacity. And because insight and these sort of deep moments of epiphany, they're a feeling-based experience. They're not just a dissociated mentation. And that's sort of where we're going for. It allows our humanity to remain present as we reason in the world. And that's really kind of one of the things that's happened, is that large sections of the human population have lost that basic connection to their humanity, their ability to have empathy, to care, to extend themselves to others. In a sense, they've forgotten how to be a human being. And being a human being demands a certain willingness for exploration of our interior world. And if you think about it, the scientific focus on the exterior world, we can describe with great specificity the tiniest things, really, from the exterior world, from all the dissection that's been going on. But if you ask somebody about their interior world and expect that same kind of, sophistication of perception, it's extremely uncommon to run into it. I mean, we use the word love for broccoli, our dog, or our child, for instance, but there's obviously a difference in that realm. And so you might say that interior sophistication is an incredibly important part of being a human being. And I think that's really, I think we've exhausted the older paradigm. Pretty much everybody knows that, and something new has to take its place, and it means being a different kind of a human being than what we've been being for quite a while, I think.
Do you think that this separation from that sense has anything to do with the rise in opiate use and SSRIs in say the U.S. culture?
Well, the thing about opiate use is, I learned a long time ago that when something gets in the newspaper, it's not usually very accurate. Now, sometimes it is, but the whole opiate thing, it's a very kind of shallow frame of reference that's looking at it. And, I think that if anything should be made seriously illegal, it would be antibiotics, since they're disturbing the entire microbiome of the planet and destabilizing ecological systems that are hundreds of millions of years old. Whereas opiates are a whole other thing. They're not quite in that category of dangerousness. And, I understand the reason why people take opiates. I mean, I'm different in that I've spent years and years and years working with my body, working with my emotional body, working with my mind to become as integrated as a human being as I can. And the thing is about working, I'm 67 now, working with my body for years and years and years, there's a certain amount of wear and tear that happens, and a certain kind of, once you reach a certain old age process, there's a certain kind of pain that is constant. And I understand that. And then, but when you combine that with, in our culture, the United States is in many ways an extremely brutal culture, even though they have this superficial nice thing on top of it. And there's very little caring in the culture itself. And since 9/11, that's diminished even further. So you have people that labor with their bodies their whole lives, and they are dispensed with as relatively useless. They're referred to as deplorables often, or the members of the flyover states, and that they're not as valuable somehow as people that think with their minds. They're having trouble finding work. So what you get is this combination of people that are in physical pain and emotional pain, and there's this deep soul pain of not being loved by their community. There's this kind of thing where Robert Bly had this great line once. He said, any part of ourselves that we do not love will become hostile to us. Mm. But that's also true in our culture. Any part of our culture that we don't care about will become hostile to us. But they feel that lack of caring. I mean, as an artisan in wood for, over 40 years now, I felt that kind of shift in the level of respect the culture gives that. In Mexico, people that work in wood are called artesanos. Here they're called a carpenter. And there's a difference. There's a kind of a luminosity to the word artesano, which you feel some deeper element there. So when somebody takes an opiate, it dulls the physical pain, but it also dulls the other pains as well. It's quite elegant at doing that. And I think it's a real symptom of a soul sickness in the culture, that they represent more really of, the canary in the coal mine idea. They're telling us something about ourselves and our culture that a lot of us just don't want to see. So I don't think it's an epidemic so much as it is a symptom of a sickness that they're just happen to be the symptom of at this particular time.
Let's look at bacteria, viruses inside of this megabiome of the earth. Now, you've written extensively about this from a medical perspective and from a shamanic perspective. And I wonder if we can sort of straddle the two worlds and talk to us about bacteria, especially the ones that are affecting humans, we'll say negatively, for lack of a better word, and what role you think they are playing and how they operate and what kind of consciousness they have, if you can speak to that.
What's really interesting about bacteria is, in my book on plant intelligence, I talk about the bacterial microbiome of the earth, and I quote in depth quite a number of bacteriologists who have spent their entire lives working with them and studying them, and who we've trained in this Western reductive system. And all of them are really clear about it. They go, bacteria are highly intelligent. They have language. They engage in highly sophisticated tool use. They make electricity to heat their cities. They care for their offspring. They communicate, on and on and on and on and on. And so, basically they're all saying now these are highly intelligent organisms, far more intelligent than the human species. So that's sort of changing this whole concept that we've all been trained in, that came into the world with the bacterial theory of disease. And, there's very, very few of the world's microorganisms have even been found or named by human scientists. The number of viruses far exceeds anything we're even aware of. So when people, for instance, researchers look at the human microbiome, in which, to simplify it a little bit, they'd be looking, let's say, at bacteria, viruses, and fungi that live in our guts or our lungs as part of the microbiome. They can only find and name about 1% of them. They don't know how to recognize the others, and they don't know what they do. They don't, but they know if it's disturbed, we become unhealthy. So you've got this, and Lynn Margulis, whose whole work on symbiogenetics and the growth of the microbiome of the planet, which she referred to as a superorganism. And what she showed in her work was that everything that we see on Earth, every living organism, is merely bacteria modified into a more sophisticated form. That over the billions of years, this kind of complexity came into being, that human beings are simply a form of modified bacteria. So are plants, so are every animal that we see, everything. And so that increase in complexity helps stabilize the exquisitely balanced, self-organized entity that's the microbiome of the planet. We're ecological beings on an ecological planet. So, and she would say, bacteria have far more important things to do than to eat our food, to eat our bodies while we're still alive, to compete with us for all of this stuff. So, there's thousands upon thousands, millions of species that are doing things that we don't even notice. And it's important to realize that human beings are supposed to biodegrade. We don't really like thinking about that, but nevertheless, we're biodegrading right now as I speak. And we emerge out of the ecological matrix of the planet, and we live for a while, and then we're subsumed back into it again. And so there's very ancient, very powerful ecological mechanisms that are in play all of the time on the Earth in terms of life forms emerging and then submerging back into that ecological matrix that we've come from. So there has to be some sort of death on the planet. Even if scientists got rid of every cause of death, there would still be death because it's built into the system. So it was long ago for me that I developed quite a good relationship with bacteria and viruses, and the microbial world. I think quite highly of them, and without them we wouldn't be alive. Without the microbiome in our GI tract, we wouldn't be alive. Without the one in our skin, without the one in our lungs, we basically have these very powerful ancient coevolutionary microbial species that live on and in us, that without them we wouldn't be healthy, we wouldn't be alive.
So how does one relate to the more virulent forms of bacteria and viruses? Because from an allopathic perspective, it's very much a kill or be killed kind of relationship, right? It's like you're going to take this thing and knock it out. But it seems like you're suggesting a different kind of relationship, even if that bacteria, virus, or fungus could be detrimental to health.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of issues that really come up there. One of them that's really crucial is that our culture, especially the Western world in general, but the United States especially, that we've hidden birth and death away from everybody. I mean, when I was growing up, it was just really starting to change. When my wife was growing up, it was before that change, and because she's a little older, and people died in their houses. They would get sick, the extended family would be there, they'd be with them through the dying process. The children were born in the houses, and they'd be there during that whole process and the growing up. People would get sick, people would die, people would get hurt, but there wasn't this sort of sequestering away of old people, our dying people, our And for sure, they didn't, when somebody was being buried, they didn't use astroturf to cover the mound of dirt so it would hide from people what was about to happen, you know. So that kind of thing, our dissociation from that cycle of life, when we were not around something, when something's alien to us like that, we tend to become more afraid of it. And that's a real problem that we have now. We've been trained to believe life should be safe and we should live, you know, to be like a bazillion years old or something with no disease or no trouble. And that's completely unrealistic. It's not the way things work. Our diseases that we struggle with are often some of our greatest teachers. So, and all of us are going to have to encounter that sometime in our life. So, you know, then you start to look, you know, address more directly your question when there's dynamics in place. So, you know, we get an infection of some sort, and yeah, you can treat it, and you can treat it herbally just as well as effectively as you can treat it antibacterially. And basically, in that instance, you kill enough of that particular bacteria that the immune system can then deal with what's going on, and you come back to some sort of level of balance and health that you can continue on longer. And you know, those kind of so there's sort of those acute pathogenic microbial diseases where we get really sick. And then there's stealth infections like Lyme disease, which is a whole other thing. They are parasites that live in our body and they destabilize its functioning so that they can use cellular structures to feed and continue to live. But that by doing that, we become weakened, and various people become weakened more than other people in various different ways. And that's a different kind of treatment. You know, the medical system tries to use antibiotics to deal with that. It works about 60% of the time. The rest of the people, it doesn't really work for. And then there's things like COPD, which is an obstructive pulmonary disease of the lungs, which is an even different thing. And that, the interesting thing, all of these things do have something in common that more and more research is starting to show, and that's that when the microbiome of our bodies is disturbed, we're much more susceptible to disease. So by restoring that microbiome, then we become a lot more vital, and then you can deal with these diseases that come and go on top of the thing. But the real truth is, and nothing is going to change this, and it sounds terrible. I mean, we've got these competing moral goods that are always the most difficult kind of problem to deal with. A certain number of people are going to die all the time. It's just the way life is. And population problems have a horrible way of solving themselves. So it's very sad. It's this tremendous grief thing when somebody that you love dies. But at the same time, if everybody lives, then we're all of a sudden facing a massive draw on the planet's ability to sustain itself. And one way or another, that problem has to be solved. So we have these tremendous competing goods that are in conflict with each other. A child dying, are many of us dying because of epidemics that come through because the population has reached unsustainable levels. And I don't know an easy solution to that. And I don't think anybody does. I don't think there is an easy solution to that.
I heard you once talking in, I don't know if it was an interview or it was in your book, in relationship to using a pharmaceutical intervention to go after whatever the microbial was, you know, some kind of virulent microbial, and that they're so adaptable that they're just kind of stepping sideways as that bullet goes by and upgrading themselves in that whole process, and that plants have sort of an equally evolving intelligence, that they're able to kind of upgrade themselves on the same level of acceleration, if you will. Is that true? And can you explain that a little bit more? Because I found that fascinating. Well, yeah, those bacteria, they're adapting, but so are other sort of allies that we have.
Right. I mean, we kind of have been taught that evolution ended when we showed up and PhDs were created in colleges and TV and stuff, but it's not really true. It's a constant, ongoing, and I don't actually like the word evolution. I like the word innovation. I think the earth and all of its organisms are constantly innovating all of the time. So you have to understand bacteria, 3.5 billion, 4 billion years old, they've run into antibacterial substances before, virtually over their entire lifespan, and they're very adaptable in analyzing an antibacterial substance, how it affects them. And so they can do things like they can change the part of their body that they actually can rework their DNA structure and their physiological expression so that the antibiotic just can't affect them at all. Sometimes they take the antibiotic in and it makes them sick, so they've created these things called efflux pumps that pump it out, and on and on and on. And they have all these different ways, scores of ways to become resistant to antibiotics. And the other thing is they share that information with each other. They're really promiscuous about that, and they actually give each other little snippets of DNA that they weave into their own genome, so that it's like that gives them the information on how to change themselves so that they won't be affected. But of course, bacteria want to eat things, and one of the things they eat are plants. And so plants have been around 700 million years. They've been getting infected a long time. They get sick just like we do. They can't call the doctor or go to the hospital. So they just have to sort of sit there and take it. And so they're extremely elegant, and they can analyze exactly what organism is feeding on them. And it doesn't matter whether it's a bacteria or a virus or an elk, for instance, or human beings. It doesn't matter. They'll analyze whatever it is that's feeding on them, and they'll create a response. So let's say with the berberine family, so like that's golden seal and Oregon grapefruit, there's a number of plants that have berberine, which is a very powerful antibacterial. So the plant begins creating this berberine, and it releases it around its body, and it gets to the bacteria that's feeding on them, and it kills it. And the plant goes, okay, I feel great. Well, the bacteria are exposed to that, and they go, I don't really like that. So they figure out a way to deactivate the berberine. And what they do is in this instance, they create an efflux pump. So as the berberine goes in their body, they have a little mechanism that pumps it back out. So they're fine. They keep feeding. The plant goes, oh, well, that really sucks. And so the plant then is able to exactly analyze the efflux pump that the bacteria made, and they create an efflux pump inhibitor, which stops that. And this goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, century after century, millennia after millennia. And so that's why when, some people talk about standardizing herbal medicines, it's really foolish, because they want to standardize these kind of plants for their berberine content. But then if they're not also standardizing it for the efflux pump inhibitor, then that's no good. And then berberine is also fairly toxic in the body, so that's why and it's toxic to the plant too. So it creates a lot of other substances which negate. It kind of protects their physiology from the negative aspects of it, and they create other compounds which are highly synergistic, that when we take it, it helps the compounds move across our intestinal membrane into our blood more easily. And So what you get is the plant you harvest this year is never the same as the plant you harvested last year. It won't be the same 50 years from now because everything is constantly changing all the time. And what's more, a plant will have hundreds, if not thousands, of these kind of chemical compounds that it creates. So when bacterial organisms face a plant, they're not facing a silver bullet like penicillin, like we have in our medical system. They're facing this incredibly complicated, holistic, synergistic array of compounds that all work together. And it's much harder for the bacteria to move out of the way. Plus, as well, plants are ecological medicines. They biodegrade very readily, but the antibiotics that human beings make don't biodegrade very well. They're synthetic substances primarily made in many instances from fossil fuels in chemical laboratories, and they're tweaked so they can get a patent on them. They're usually substances that don't normally appear in nature. And so we excrete them out of our body. That's why we have to take them all the time. And they go into the ecosystem where they generally do not biodegrade. And if we take an antibiotic, it continues out in the world killing all kinds of bacteria that it comes into contact with, which is what is driving antibacterial resistance dynamics throughout the entire world ecosystem. So, just that little thing of assuming that, bacteria are bad and we are smart enough to figure this thing out and then protect ourselves from disease, it has these kind of shadow domino effect things that just go on and on and on. And plants are just a whole different way of approaching things.
Well, when you frame it like that, it seems like it's best to just kind of piggyback on the work and innovation the plants have already done.
Well, yeah, of course it is. And that's one of the reasons why pharmaceutical companies are always studying plants, because they're trying to find, but they're doing it in a very simplistic way. I mean, their primary orientation is how can we the medical science or the medicine in the United States, it basically has three approaches: cut, kill, or force. That's their world. So, if you get a cancer, they cut it out, all right? Or if you have a bacterial infection, they kill it. And force comes into play. So let's say you have high blood pressure, they give you a pill to force it down into what they say is the normal range. And that's their frame of reference. So they study plant compounds intensively to find plant compounds that will work in killing or forcing, right? And so they find a plant compound and they go, oh, this one, and they test thousands of them continually, and they go, this one looks promising, and then they'll start testing them on mice and doing all kinds of stuff, and then they get to the point where they go, well, we think this will really work, and what they then will often do is they'll create an artificial compound very similar to that one and take it through the testing process so they can get a patent on it. It tends to be a single substance. It's not a complex grouping of substances. And, they make an enormous amount of money. The pharmaceutical companies are, I believe, the research I did recently, they're the most profitable companies in the world. And the medical industry is the most profitable segment of the economy in the United States. It's the biggest employer at this point, and it's got the most money going into it. And it's really about the money, not about healing. It's not about ecological sensitivity. Very few things that occur in a doctor's office or a hospital is biodegradable. Most of it comes one way or another from fossil fuels. And so, yeah, it's a whole other frame of reference. Whereas coming over here and looking at plant and using plants directly with great sophistication, which is been a part of my focus for very long time, to get it sort of beyond the kitchen herbalism thing, which I think is fine in and of itself, and I like it very much. But nevertheless, when you're dealing with acute, sophisticated disease dynamics, plants are as good as pharmaceuticals, and in many ways superior, because they don't have side effects for the most part. I mean, side effects from properly prescribed pharmaceuticals, they kill about 100,000, 140,000 people a year, and about 3 million a year are permanently disabled or hospitalized from that. You don't get that with herbal medicine. So, yeah, it would make, Gary Paul Navin had this great saying once. He goes, our epitaph as a species could be, they died when there was easily accessible, readily usable natural remedies at hand.
Let's talk about the immune system, because if one was sort of orienting themselves towards surviving in this microbiology soup that we are, the human body is like constantly, well, really is like a storehouse for that, but it's also all around us on the exterior as well. Instead of sort of pointing a gun at each one of these things that could potentially make us sick and trying to shoot them all before they kill us, it almost seems like optimizing our immune system to be flexible, adaptable, resilient, and robust is our best chance of thriving in an environment like that. And so if you could maybe speak to that a bit, and tell us what could be some great allies in that regard.
Well, I mean, one of the things to understand is that the entire microbiome of the planet is being disturbed by synthetic chemicals, most of them that are coming from hydrocarbons from fossil fuels. And ever since chemistry and the chemical industry got to be the way that it is, it's been creating more and more of these artificial substances. And literally, we and our entire environment is bathed in these things, and different kinds of synthetic volatiles. It's in our food, it's in our medicines, it's in basically everything. And so whenever we take that stuff into ourselves, it's creating a disturbance in the microbiome of the body, which is the first part of our immune system. So really, and it's like odd, and I've been, I'm about 1,000 or so journal papers into my research on chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And what's interesting is that the number one thing that they mention over and over and over again that they see as a predicating factor for the emergence of the disease later in life is the use of antibiotics. I've never seen that in journal articles so specifically emphasized. But all kinds of pharmaceuticals change our microbiome. A lot of the synthetic substances in the food we eat disturb it. When we fill up our gas tank and we breathe in those fumes, that disturbs it. So it goes on and on and on. And so really the easiest first thing that any of us can do is to take a really, really good probiotic all the time. And, then you start getting into this kind of healthcare that the health system should pay for but doesn't. The really good probiotics have many, many organisms in it. They tend to run about 40 to 45, sometimes even $50 for a 2-month supply. Nevertheless, that's the best one to take. If money's a real problem, then probably the best one after that is one called PB8, meaning probiotic 8. It has 8 organisms in it. I think that runs $19 or $20, but I wouldn't go any cheaper than that one. So that's the first thing to do. And, I'm not a big fan of diet fanatics. They've been irritating me my whole life, basically telling me what I can eat. And if I wanted to live with my mother, I'd live with my mother, but basically you just need to eat some kind of fiber that's fun for you, because that's what the bacteria in the gut ferment, and it keeps them really healthy. And so it can be anything, avocados or mangoes or, green vegetables, if you like that. are just even a really great healthy piece of sourdough bread. So just to sort of have that in your food and to try to not have so many synthetics. And that's the way I look at it, not so much I'm eating right to keep fit, but basically I'm feeding my microbiome so that it'll be happy. And then after that, the next thing you can do after that is there's a whole category of plants called adaptogens. And those are extremely good at helping the immune system be more responsive to stresses. And an adaptogen, the way it works is, if a part of your body is overexcited, it will lower it. If a part of your body is not vital enough, it will raise it up. So it adapts you to stressors and functioning so that you're in a more of an optimum range. And there's a lot of good ones. Astragalus is probably the most famous. Eleutherococcus is pretty famous. They used to call it Siberian ginseng. Ashwagandha is a very good one. Rhodiola is a very good one. Gynostemma is another one that I'm just starting to work with. So those are probably the best grouping of adaptogens for people to take, and I take those regularly every day. And I take a powder mix of stuff like that at night, about 1/8 of a cup in liquid before I go to bed, and just to keep things as vital as I possibly can.
For the folks that are do-it-yourselfers and they want to get as close to those herbs that you mentioned as possible, as connected to them as possible, can you? I mean, are these things that are wild in the latitude that you live in, like in the latitude of the United States, where people could go source that, so they could go forage for them and then powderize them and then take them in
Those are more difficult to forage for. Rhodiola you can kind of find. I'm not aware of that many wild crafters that are working with it. Most of these are plants that aren't native to the United States. Probably the most famous kind of adaptogen in the United States, sort of in that category, would be American ginseng. And then there's some others, like burdock has some adaptogenic qualities, for instance. But American ginseng's been over-harvested. So what has happened is a lot of people are now starting to grow these plants. The closest adaptogens that you can find wild would be mushrooms. And that's not a super strong area for me, but reishi mushrooms are a pretty good adaptogen. You can find those growing on trees throughout the world. They're all over the United States. Chaga mushroom is another one. Turkey tails are another one. But that's not exactly my area. But I do know that the awareness of mushroom medicine has been growing. Christopher Hobbs, the herbalist, was the first one that sort of began to make us aware of this world back in the 80s. And there's some extremely good books on medicinal mushrooms out now, all color with photographs of all of them. I mean, cordyceps mushroom is another one that's a really good adaptogen. And so those, when I used to hunt mushrooms for food back in the 80s, it was the 70s. Oh my God. Anyway, I used to find a lot of those mushrooms, but I didn't really know what they were because I was focused more on foraging for food mushrooms. But those are really common a lot of different places in the United States. And a lot of the mushrooms out there have very potent medicinal effects. And there are really a couple of very, very good and moderately expensive medicinal mushroom guides. And that would be, if people want to do that, wild crafting, that's a great place to start. Another thing that is really possible is pine pollen. That's a very, very good nutrient food that has some adaptogenic qualities. And I started writing about that, 15 or 20 years ago. and it sort of then took off. And there's huge numbers of people wildcrafting that now as this majorly nutritious raw food, and it, it's produced in thousands of pounds sometimes in the years, and you can just, sweep it up into trash cans full. So those are things you can do. Other than that, there's a guy named Rickert, CECH, in Oregon, who sells a lot of the seeds and herbs for these adaptogens. They're pretty easy to grow. Some of them are considered a bit invasive once they get started, which I always think is wonderful, but environmentalists kind of hate me when I say that. And and there's a lot of great farmers that are growing this stuff organically, so you can buy it usually in large, pounds at a time from people, and work with it that way. And that's really the best way to get it if you're going to buy it, actually.
Pine pollen, you mentioned that, and I think I've heard, I'm not sure from what source, that this can enhance testosterone. Is that true?
Well, pine pollen itself I'm the one that sort of started writing about that, because I'd been hearing about estrogenic plants to help menopause and things like that for years. And it took me, 10 years to finally ask myself the question, what about testosterone plants, androgenic plants? And nobody'd really ever thought of that in the herbal world, which was strange. And I started looking, and it turns out that pine pollen is really, really high in testosterone, exactly the same that's in our bodies. It's common in the plant world, but pine pollen's the one thing that I know of that it's easily accessible in. That's probably in other pollens too, but I haven't been able to find any studies on that. And it's traditional in the Asian countries as a nutrient. If you eat it, like Koreans, they use it like a flour, and they make muffins and all kinds of things out of it. One of their words for them is the pine pollen people. But if you tincture pine pollen with an alcohol water combination, and then you take the tincture and you kind of hold it in your mouth, then those constituents, the testosterone in it, will pass through the mucous membranes into the blood supply and raise testosterone levels pretty rapidly. And I was going through andropause, which men go through in middle age, and when I was in my early 40s, and I wanted something to deal with that, and that's sort of where this came from initially. So yeah, if you eat a lot of it, of the pine pollen itself is a constant in your food, it will bring up testosterone, but the easiest way to do it is when you take tinctures and hold it in your mouth and just let the tincture go through the mucous membranes. Usually then after, when you swallow whatever's left, it doesn't really make it to the stomach. It just goes right through the whole mucous membranes into the blood supply.
Funny, on that topic, I've heard you mention hops does the opposite.
Oh yeah, hops is hilarious. That's like, if you get on live, you Google me online, you start to find all of these people that love IPAs but just hate me. They're like, does hops cause man boobs? And then they go, no, this asshole Stephen Buhner, he's writing about it, he's a complete idiot. We hate him. It's odd. That's the one thing I've ever written about that's gotten the most press, because it's the most controversial, and controversy is always fun. But hops was never put in beer prior to about 1500. And it was what was used in beer. There's been scores of plants used in beer, which I've written about in a book on that. And the Catholics had sort of a monopoly on the creation of gruit, which was a particular kind of beer that was the beer of its day. And the herbs that they put in it were mildly psychotropic and sexually stimulating. And they also, were antibacterial, so they kept the beer from spoilage. But then there were a lot of other kinds of herbs put in there, like henbane, which is what Pilsner beer originally was a henbane ale, which the more you drank of it, the more horny you got, and the more you felt like going and raping and pillaging your neighboring countries. So the Germans finally outlawed that with the Beer Purity Act in 1500, and it was really driven by Protestants who wanted to break the Catholic monopoly. And also, hops puts the drinker to sleep and dulls sexual drive. It's got the most estrogenic compounds of any plant on the planet. And so it basically, if you drink a huge amount of it, it begins to dull the sexual drive. And there's a well-known condition in England that's been known for centuries amongst brewers that handle a lot of hops called brewer's droop, because they just can't get erections because the constituents in the hops also tend to go right through the skin into the bloodstream. And so that's sort of that thing. And I'm not a fan of hopped beers, especially for the older men get. Pine ales are a lot better for people. Gruit ales are a lot better. But interestingly enough, women going through menopause or later in life, they start to get more fond of beers because it adds more estrogenic compounds into their system. Whereas when they're younger, they're not really interested.
Wow. From let's just transition. We got a couple minutes left, and I'm interested to know other people's work that you're excited about. What research exists out there that you're fascinated by, if any, and what do you see in this regard?
Well, there's all of these new people coming up that are filled with fire, that are doing really fascinating work. So the plant neurobiologists, if that had existed when I was 18 and starting to go to college, that's where I would have begun. And these people are really highly trained scientists. They take no prisoners. They suffer fools badly. And because they're writing about the plant neural network, which is the root system, and how intelligent that the plants are. And so they're in constant fights with everybody in the scientific community that wants to believe continually that plants are stupid. So these guys are really fun to read because they're incredibly hilarious. And I really like reading people that are writing about deep Gaia, like Stephen Harding at Schumacher College. He has one book out and he's got a couple more in process. I've been urging him to write more for a while. He's great. I'm very fond. Mary Midgley, who just died recently, was an English philosopher, and her stuff is really remarkable about, she parses the problems in the Western scientific philosophical paradigm. And she's a hilarious writer and really, really enjoyable to read. And I've been working my way through her entire work. I mean, she was publishing right up to when she died, and she's one of the best writers and most sophisticated thinkers I've ever run across in my life. And so those are kind of some of the people that I'm reading these days.
Excellent. You've got 2 books that you're writing right now. Is that correct?
Right. I'm working on a clinical treatment book for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which would be kind of similar to my book on Lyme, treating Lyme disease, because it comes from a real ecological perspective, and it's taking a lot more work than I figured it would. And then the other one is called Becoming Vegetalista, and that's a term. It's a bad Spanish translation of a Quechua term from South America. It's about people in whom the living green intelligence of the world comes to live, what Hildegard of Bingen would have called viriditas, meaning the intelligence of the green world. And they're sort of called to their work by an experience with a plant intelligence, quite often through taking ayahuasca or something like that. And then they sort of carry that visionary experience inside of them. And that's really my own experience. The plants were my major teachers and trainers, and that's been 50 years ago now that whole process began for me. And I think a lot of the herbal movement in the United States, when I first started teaching about having sort of visionary experiences with plants, and the plants communicated with people, I was nervous to talk about it because it's certainly breaking a huge cultural injunction to say something like that. And the first class I ever taught, must have been 60 people there, 60 herbalists standing room only. I was like, gee, I guess other people have been having this experience too. And so that sort of ability to interact with the intelligence and communicability of the green world is foundational for me. So that book is about that process, but written from a very experiential point of view. It's hard to explain. It's a combination of nonfiction, fictional stories, and poetry in this unique sort of form so that the readers have an experience of what that's like. It's, anyway, hard to explain. But the first fourth of the book, it's in 4 sections. The first fourth of it was published in an edition of about 650 copies by a small publisher in England in hardcover, which you can still, I think they've got 40 or 50 copies left that you can get on Amazon, for instance. So
Excellent.
that's sort of what that is. It's like reading it is like going in this sort of, you might say, reading it, you experience a great deal of ontological flexibility, or as other people would say, a psychonautical experience.
Well, best wishes on those finishing those and on the releases. Please give us your website before we sign off.
Okay, you can get to mine directly, which is stephenharrodbuhner.com. And there's also Gaianstudies.org, which is also the foundation of Gaian Studies website.